All right, so we're going to talk now about explicit versus implicit communication, right? So do we know what I mean when I say implicit? I mean something's implied, right? So this is something about communication, right? An author can say something and they could, by what they're saying, they can imply something, or they could just outright state it and make that point explicit, right? So that's a choice that an author has. And sometimes something will be implied, but usually the main point is explicit. Does that make sense? So let me give you some examples of this. If something, I'll put it this way, like if someone's saying something and there's an implication of what they're saying, it's not as important as what's explicitly stated. And conversely, if something is implied, but then they choose to say, make it explicit, now you know they're emphasizing it. So maybe it'll be more clear as we look at some examples. A lot of the examples the examples I came up with regard participles in Greek. So this is a little bit grammar geeky again, but in English, participles are ing words. Running, jumping, anything that ends in ing. And those words are verbs, but they're not what we call finite verbs. So like he went, right? Or, that's an explicit verb, like he went somewhere. But I could say he went to the store laughing. You with me? So laughing now, it's a verb, but it's not like the main verb of the sentence. It's telling you he went to the store while laughing or something along those lines. So Greek and Hebrew, but especially Greek, uses a lot of participles. And they'll just kind of be connected to the rest of the sentence. And I'll just give you the most probably, maybe you've even heard of this example before, but in the Great Commission in Matthew 28, right? Most of our translations say, go therefore and make disciples of all the nations. And you know the rest of the verse, right? But actually, go, like in English, when I say go, that's a command, right? It's an imperative. But in Greek, it's not. In Greek, literally, it's going, make disciples. You with me? Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't go, but it tells us that the main idea is what? Make disciples, exactly, right? And going is kind of how you do that. It's something that kind of goes along with it, right? But they're in Greek, they're not the exact same level. Go and do this. It's like, while you're going, make disciples or something along those lines. You with me? And so it's not explicitly a command. It's maybe an implicit command. Well, if you're going to make disciples, you're going to have to go. But it's implicit versus explicit. Like, you got to go. That's not what Jesus is saying. You got to go and you got to make disciples. It's more like, as you go or when you go, while you go, something along those lines, make disciples. Here's the command. And this is kind of implied. Yeah, you're going to have to go. You can't just stay at home and make disciples, right? Obviously, it's to the ends of the earth. Let me give you some other examples. 1 Peter 1, 17 and 18. If you call on him as Father who judges impartially according to each one's deeds, and here's the command, conduct yourselves with fear. You can say live in fear throughout the time of your exile. And then depending on your translation, here's the participle, knowing that you were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers. One of the things we like to do it's like if you're going to break down these two verses, you want to break them down to grammatically their most essential parts. You with me? And then see how all the other phrases kind of like connect or attach. So if you're going to break down this sentence, the whole first part of it in verse 17, it could be like this. Live in fear, knowing that you were redeemed. You with me? If you're going to break down that whole sentence to like the main command and the main supporting argument, live in fear, knowing that you are redeemed. You with me? Okay, all the other parts are kind of like, those are like the two main tree branches, and the other parts are like the branches that connect on. Are you with me? So, live in fear, knowing that you are redeemed. Those are two, we call them clauses, we call them clauses, okay? Now the question is, what's the connection between those clauses? Live in fear, knowing that you are redeemed. Anyone have a guess at that? What's the connection? What does he mean when he says live in fear? Okay, I get that. Like I live in the fear of God. I live in awe of God, knowing that you are redeemed. And then he goes on, knowing that you're redeemed or ransomed from the futile ways of your father, not with perishable things such as silver or gold. And he goes on to say what? But with precious blood, the blood of Christ. Okay, so what's the connection? Live in fear, knowing that you're redeemed. We call it a causal connection. Like one of the ways you could translate this, live in fear because you know that you are redeemed with, not just with silver and gold, this perishable stuff, but you are redeemed with the precious blood of Christ. Okay? So these are those two clauses, and Peter doesn't make it explicit here, but it's implied that there's a because in there. Does that make sense? It's implied. It's not explicit. He could have said because you know that you've redeemed, but he just said live in fear knowing that you're redeemed. It's implied, though, that these two things are connected. Okay? And so it's our job then to figure out, well, what's he saying? What's he implying here about the connection? And and if you spend a little bit of time thinking about that, you go, oh, he's saying this knowledge should what? Should cause me to live in fear. This knowledge that I have been redeemed with the precious blood of Christ, not even with something as temporal as silver or gold, as valuable as the world may find those things. It's just transitory. No, the blood of the Son of God redeemed me, and that should what? Knowing that should cause me to live in reverence for God. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so, but what I'm telling us here is that connection, he makes these two clauses, these two statements, live in fear, knowing that you are redeemed. There's a connection implied between those statements. Okay? You tracking? And that's our job to figure out, what's implied there? What's that implied connection? Now, he could have made it explicit. He just left it for us to figure out. But in this case, okay, now I see. These two sentences are connected. Knowing this should cause this. We call that a causal connection. Are you tracking? Okay. Same thing in 1 Peter 1. I have all these examples from 1 Peter because Peter loves these participles. Right? Having purified your souls by your obedience to the truth for sincere brotherly love, love one another earnestly from a pure heart. Okay, so once again, there's the command, love one another. But then he says what? Having purified your souls by your obedience to the truth for a sincere brotherly love. So once again, just boil it down to the most basic parts. Having purified your souls, love one another. Okay, what's the connection? I don't know. There's could be different connections. It could be causal, it could be this, that. But I think it's quite possibly here almost like a prerequisite. By having purified your souls, love one another. This is what you need. Your soul has to be pure. You're not going to be able to love unless you've purified your souls. And so he doesn't explicitly come out and say that. He just puts those two clauses and it's implied. What's the connection? And then as a good detective, we're trying to figure out, well, how does this have to do with that? Does that make sense? I'll give you another example. 1 Peter 2. Now this one, once again, kind of like the Great Commission, it's translated like it's two commands. Put away all malice and all deceit and hypocrisy and envy, but it literally it's putting away, it's a participle again, all malice and deceit and hypocrisy and envy and slander. Like newborn infants, what's the main command? Long for the pure spiritual milk of the word. So once again, you're going to just boil this down into its basic parts. Putting away all malice, long for the word. Okay, so those are the two parts. What's the connection? It's just kind of implied. And I would suggest it's very similar to the other one, right? You can translate it by putting away all malice, long for the word. This is how we do it. All the deceit and the malice and the envy and the hypocrisy and slander in our hearts, it prevent us from longing for what we should. Our desires are all off. Okay, so there's a connection there that is just, once again, it's implicit. It's not explicit. Okay, but so I'm going to give you now a contrast between the connection that's implicit and one that's explicit. So in Philippians 2:6, right, talking about Jesus, of course, who, though he was in the form of God, and literally it's being in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. Now the although, it's not in the original Greek. It's just implied. It's just Jesus being in the form of God did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. Okay, so once again, boil it down. Jesus being God, you could boil the other part, did not fight for equality, or you could paraphrase that different ways, okay? You with me? What's the connection? It's even though he was God, he didn't hold on to his rights. You with me? But that although, that's implied. It's just Paul there is kind of leaving it. He's just like, Jesus being God didn't do this. What's the connection? Okay, but interesting, like in Hebrews, kind of a similar sentence, Hebrews 5:8, although he was a son, he learned obedience. That although, it's in the text, right? And the author of Hebrews put it in as like this contrast. So it's a little bit more emphatic. Does that make sense? So if you have like the NASB or one of these kinds of translations, they'll put words in italics, right? You ever seen that? What does the italics mean? You want to know? What's that? No. Unfortunately, that's what a lot of people think. But it's the opposite of that. It's in italics because it's not in the Greek. It's saying this is implied. Now, in normal English writing, we put things in italic for emphasis, right? That's how we normally do things. But in like the NASB and these translations, it's actually the opposite. It's actually saying this isn't actually in the text, but it's kind of implied. Does that make sense? And so, this is kind of the joke of a young preacher. It gets up. He's like, this is in italics. It makes that the main point of his sermon, right? And it's kind of like, oh, wait, you made the main point the thing that actually wasn't in the text. It's just kind of implied. And we want to make the main point of the sermon what? What's explicit, what's stated. You with me? So once again, it's just being kind of aware, like, there's an author, if he wants to emphasize something, he could always make something explicit, can't he? He could always use extra words to emphasize, just like this contrast here between Philippians and Hebrews. Paul could have said, although, that word is in Greek, but a lot of times it's just kind of implied. But then the author of Hebrews is like, even though he was the Son of God, he learned obedience. You with me? So there it's very emphatic, even though, although. With Philippians, I mean, theologically it's still there. Like, he's the Son of God and he didn't count equality, but that although wasn't explicit, it's just implicit. And so I guess I'll put it this way. There's always, in different languages, there's not always there's almost never a one-to-one correspondence between two words, right? I think this might be in the notes later, but it kind of fits here. Like, for example, in Hebrew, my favorite word in Hebrew, should be your favorite word in Hebrew, is this word chesed. It means loyal love or faithful love. It's the character quality about God that's most praised about him in the Psalms. It goes back to Exodus, right? God, the loving and compassionate God, all these statements about God in Exodus, it's this word. And all throughout the Psalms, his loyal love endures forever. I mean, over and over and over and over in the Psalms, it's the number one character quality of God that's praised, okay? Now that word, it's like, well, how do we translate it? Love, faithfulness, right? It's broader than that. You can't capture it with just one word, right? So sometimes, you're kind of forced almost to translate with like a phrase like loyal love, right? Because of the significance there. But in other words, we don't have that concept in English, but what can we do? Well, we can explain that word with multiple words. Does that make sense? You can always do that, right? If what you're trying to communicate, you can't capture it with a single word, you can always explain it. And that's this process called circumlocution. It's just a fancy word that means explain around it, right? Have you ever done that? Like, you're like, I can't think of that word. What's that word? And you explain the word, right? And somebody is like, oh, you mean this word? You're like, oh yeah, that one word captures that whole phrase or that whole, sentence I just gave you. But if you don't have that word in your language or whatever, you could always explain it. You could always make something explicit, right? And this is where I put that example of in Finnish, all the different words for snow. So in other words, we may not have a word for all the different types of snow they have in Finnish, but we could always explain it. We could say, oh, it's a light snow that's very fluffy. Maybe they have a word for that. I don't know. But we can't say this one word that means light snow that's fluffy or heavy sleet or whatever. We don't have all these different words for it, but we could explain that. And so the point is, an author's always able to get their point across. Sometimes they just have to use extra words to explain something. Okay? So what we're looking for is is something implied, or did they take the time to really explain and make something explicit? Those are questions we're asking. Are they explaining this, giving us a lot of detail about this? Is this just something implied that they could have explained, but they didn't? Right? Once again, these are things that we're on the lookout for with our detective goggles. Okay? Here's a fun one. So there's a difference, and these are fancy linguistic terms, okay? So I'm going to try to boil it down, but semantic meaning and pragmatic effect. I love this because this is gets into, just even in English, this is helpful for us in our relationships and things. So it's helpful to distinguish what something means and the effect that meaning has. Okay, so let me give you an example. If I say your kids, we all know exactly what that means, right? Oh, I'm talking about your children, right? Or, it could be goats. Yeah. Right. Okay, I didn't put an apostrophe R-E in it, okay? So, assuming, I'm writing it, I'm saying your kids. It's talk about your kids. Oh, we're talking about your children. We all get this, right? Or your children. Okay, but what if I'm talking to my wife, normally I'd say the kids or our kids did something, but if to my wife I say, your kids made a big mess, right? The meaning of it is clear, but we would call that the pragmatic effect of my words. What am I doing? I'm distancing myself from my wife. You with me? I'm those are your kids. You see what I'm saying? Right? Because normally I'd say our kids or I'd say the kids. But in this context, I'm your kids. I'm saying this ain't my fault, right? There's a lot implied in that, right? I'm your kids did this, something you taught them. I'm blaming her, right? Right? But it's not the meaning of your kids. It's how I'm using it in that context, right? That's what we call the pragmatic. All of us know your kids. Okay, we get it, right? Let me give you another example. We call this the progressive. So even in English, it has the basic meaning of incompleteness. So if I say it's raining, that means it's not done raining, right? It's still raining. If I just say it's raining, it's an ongoing thing that hasn't finished yet, right? So that's the basic meaning of it's raining. It's a progressive. It means it's incomplete. It's not done. It's or another way to put it, it's in progress. Something is in progress. That's what the progressive tense, I'm running. It's in progress, right? You with me? That's what that means. But pragmatically, if I say Josh is polite, and this is kind of the example we used before, Josh is being polite, that conveys pragmatically insincerity, right? Josh is polite is how you'd normally say that. But if I'm saying Josh is being polite, it's oh, it's just the way he's acting. It's insincere. You with me? So the meaning of Josh is being polite. Oh, okay, Josh is being polite. But it's the effect that those words have when normally you say Josh is polite. You with me? You see that? So this is what we call pragmatic effect. And we're just kind of on the, what effects do these words have in this situation? Just kind of, once again, on the lookout for that. So here's a good example of this. We talked about this when we opened up this, I think last time or the time before. We talked about, there's so many different kinds of commands, right? Like I could order you to do something sternly so look at 3 John, it says, you will do well to send them on their journey in a manner worthy of God. Well, what is that? It's a really gentle command, isn't it? You would do well, you would do well to do your homework. It's like, I'm not saying do your homework, right? But you could see there's kind of all I'm saying is like, oh, it's a good thing to do. But in this context, in this class context, I would say you would do well to turn in your homework on time. There's a little bit of a pragmatic effect there. I'm not just making some general statement about how it's good to do homework. You with me? I'm talking to students in a class in that context. I'm saying you should do this, right? You with me? And that's kind of the same thing with 3 John. He's not just, hey, let me just throw out some good ideas here. You would do well, because he's talking about a specific situation. He's talking about some missionaries that are coming to the church. And he's not just saying, generally speaking, it's a good idea to care for missionaries. He's like, hey, some missionaries are coming to your church. It would be good for you to care for them, right? You see what I'm saying? Like in that context, it's not just this general statement. It's a really gentle command to them. Like, hey, you should do this. Does that make sense? Now, in a different context, if we're just talking in general and, this wasn't a class and I'm like, yeah, you should do your homework. I'm not telling you to do anything specific, in that case, right? But in this case, it's not just this general, it's a good idea to do something, right? Does that make sense? All right. So, some various kinds of constructions can be pragmatic commands, even though they're not literal commands. Right? That's just the implication, the pragmatic effect. Okay, so I'm just going to keep kind of plowing through these. So, grammar. How many of you, have any of us ever been like, to use the pejorative term, like spelling Nazis or like grammar Nazis? You know what I'm talking about, right? Like, this is how you speak in English. Well, we have to understand here something about language. Language changes over time, doesn't it? If you were to read English from 400 years ago, guess what? It wouldn't follow any of your spelling or grammar rules, would it? It's changed so much. And, why we're bringing this out is that we teach grammar in schools, don't we? Or we used to, okay, this is how you speak proper English, right? But really, throughout history, there hasn't been a lot of that. Like, for the most part, language is. You with me? It's always changing, and it's kind of our job to understand how language works and to use it how it's working, okay? So this is the difference between prescriptive and descriptive grammar. Prescriptive grammar says, you should talk this way. Descriptive grammar says, this is how people talk, okay? And for the most part, we want to understand that the ancient world and the ancient languages, they didn't really have a concept of prescriptive grammar. Some of them kind of did, but for the most part, it's just like, this is how we talk, and then we're trying to figure out how we talk, okay? And so, for example, spelling. Like, the fact that there's a proper way to spell things, that's actually very modern. In the past, even when there was literate cultures, they didn't have standard ways of spelling things. They spelled things phonetically, right? This is what's the problem with English, right? Things are not spelled phonetically, are they? But in ancient languages, things were always spelled phonetically. And so guess what? And this is really fascinating. If you study ancient Greek, you can actually, by their writing, tell which dialect they spoke. Why? Because they spelled it how they said it. They spelled things phonetically. Does that make sense? Right? It's fascinating. And so there's whole books written on, there's a book, a classic book written, 100 years ago called The Greek Dialects. And he looks at like all the different ways that things were spelled. Have you ever heard of like Attic and Ionic and all these Doric Greek? These are like architectural styles, but these were actually different subcultures within Greece. And they all spoke Greek, but they all spoke different dialects. And so they spelled words differently and all this kind of stuff. Now, okay, why does any of this matter? Because what I want you to understand is that the grammar, I kind of use this, Jesus talks about the Sabbath, right? He says, the Sabbath was not made for man, but man for the Sabbath. No, I said that backwards. Man is not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath for man, right? In other words, the Sabbath is meant to be a blessing. It's meant to be for you. It's not meant this rule that like constricts you. It's meant to be a blessing. And I'd say the same thing about grammar. The grammar is for the speaker, not the speaker for the grammar. Who's the Lord here? It's the speaker, not the grammar. And so grammar rules, you could just put it this way, when we figure out like what's the grammar rules of Greek or English or whatever, we're trying to describe and understand them. Why? So we can understand what people are saying, but when someone breaks the grammar rules, it's not like a sin. It's not like they've broken some rule. It's just they've spoken in a non-standard way. Does that make sense? And so actually, breaking grammar rules is a good way to emphasize something, right? Like in general, we would say we should never speak in incomplete sentences, right? And generally speaking, that's true, right? You want a subject, you want a verb. That's part of just good communication. But we do it all the time, don't we? We just say, interjections like, watch out. Well, that's a complete sentence, but oh my, or something like that. It's not a sentence. And actually, in Scripture, we find incomplete sentences. Like even in Rome, we'll get to one in just a second. And so, let me get. There's a lot of examples. Most of these you have to kind of once again know Greek to understand. But the point here is this: that when an author breaks a grammatical rule, we're just trying to understand, well, wait a minute, if this is the normal way of doing it, why did he do it different? Does that make sense? That's the basic idea. So I'll just kind of run through these really quickly. Does anyone know what a relative pronoun is? Once again, this is grammar. If I say, the man who crossed the street died, okay, that's a sentence in English. Who is a relative pronoun. So I could just say the man died, but I say the man who crossed the street. So that who crossed the street is a relative pronoun, and it describes the man, and it tells us something about him. Well, when you're reading a sentence in English, or even in your Bibles, right, you have to often match the relative pronoun with we call the antecedent, right? So the man who crossed the street died. Wait, who died? The man, but then the which man? The man who crossed the street. And you got to connect and match who crossed the street with man. You with me? Because it could be a complicated sentence with other parts to it, and there could be like and so you want to connect those so we can say, okay, the man died. Which man? The man who crossed the street. Okay, you tracking with me? Well, in Greek, there's a way of connecting that, and there's some grammar rules about that, but they didn't always follow them. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that. But just when you're reading in English, look for relative pronouns. You always want to figure out what's the antecedent. What does this go back to, right? There's tons of examples. I can think of some in 1 John, but relative pronouns, we're always trying to connect with the antecedent. There's some examples of like the endings of different words. Luke uses actually a more classic style and emphasis that wasn't normal Greek spoken at the day. And it's like he's using a more classical Greek style. It's just kind of fascinating. Spellings. Most of the times, different spellings of words aren't significant. But guess what? There's an example in 2 Peter where it's actually pretty significant. In 2 Peter 1:1, what's Peter's other name? What's his birth name? Simon, right? But guess what? It's interesting. In 2 Peter 1:1, he doesn't call himself Simon Peter. That was the common Greek. He calls himself Simeon Peter. He spells it a little bit differently. Okay? Now, why does he do that? Well, that's Simeon. When you hear the word Simeon, what are you thinking of? Old Testament, right? He's not taking, his common, just kind of Greek name. It's more like his Hebrew name. It's almost like he's going back to his birth name. Once again, it's just a slight difference in the spelling. It's kind of like the difference between Josh and Joshua. Everyone calls me Josh, but my real name is Joshua. And so, like, Peter, as he's writing 2 Peter, he opens up with his birth name. Not just the common name that everybody... Why does he do that? It's kind of... I don't know. You could look into that. But it's worth noting. Oh, he went back to his, like, birth name. He spelled it a little bit differently. Different, we call parsings. There's one kind of great example in 1 Corinthians 11. Like we have contractions in English. It's not too common in Greek, but they have them. And it's like this example where it's like, will I praise you? And he could say, I will not praise you, but he says, I won't praise you. He kind of contracts it. It's just kind of interesting. And then, as I said, the example in Romans 12:9, where Paul gives an incomplete sentence. Okay, so it's like, anyway, let me just kind of go back to this. The point is this. You have to know Greek to know Greek grammar, obviously. But the grammar is not meant to tell a speaker how to speak. The grammar is describing how people do speak. And so when we're looking at how they speak, we're like, oh, if they break a grammar rule, it's not to say that they spoke wrongly, but to say, oh, they spoke differently. Does that make sense? And so it's like, our job is just to figure out what are they saying and why. That's a little bit technical, so I'll keep moving on. Actually, some of these are technical, right? When we're talking about word meanings, this is another real technical topic, synchronics and diachronics. So what these have to do with is this, the history of words and their meanings. Okay, so, I mean, we could do this in English, like the word gay. We all know it used to have a meaning, and it's taken on a new meaning, right, over time. Like, we could think of lots of different examples like this. And when a speaker is speaking, what's most important is always the current meaning. Like, right, how the word is used today. Like, I don't care how the word was used 200 years ago. What I care about is what you mean today. You with me? But when we're studying words, so if you ever find someone like, I mean, preachers will do this sometimes. We're like, this word used to mean this. Okay, but what does it mean when the guy said it? That's what's really important. The history of the word, for the most part, is irrelevant. I want to know what it meant when he said it. Okay, and so most of the time, the history of the word is not super important. And one of the authors talked about like a chess game and used this analogy. If you look at a chess game, you don't need to know the history of the chess game. You look at the board and you know exactly everything you need to know to play the rest of the game. You with me? You don't need to know the history. But because we're not native Greek speakers or Hebrew speakers, sometimes the history of the word helps us because we don't know fully all the nuances of the word at that time. And so sometimes the history of the word can help us to key in on a nuance or a connotation that the author may have had that we just aren't aware of. And that's where I would say, like, even the word nice. That's the example I gave. Like, it's a great example of this in English. Once again, I could say you're a nice guy and not mean anything negative by it, but if you knew the history of the word, that it can mean like insincere, and then you heard me say, oh, you're being nice, you could I would never say you're being kind as kind of like an accusation of being insincere. You with me? Because kind, like, to be kind is to be kind. You with me? But to be nice, it's a little bit like, well, wait a minute, is this external or internal? Kind is, by its very nature of the word, is genuine. You with me? But nice, every time I call someone nice, it's not an insult, right? But there can be this implication that, you're not really that sincere. It's just an external thing. You're just kind of being nice, right? And if you were studying Greek from the outside, right, or studying English 2,000 years from now, knowing the history of the word, you might be able to pick up on that nuance. So anyway, we'll get into this more when we start, like, how do we do word studies? How do we figure out what a word means? We look up a word in Greek. I'll kind of talk to you about how we do that. And like, okay, you look up a word in your English Bible. Let's see what it means. And once again, the history of that word is not necessarily important, but sometimes it could give us some clues. And so there's this debate that goes on between, do we just look at the present or do we look at the past? And so this Greek scholar named Daniel Wallace, he talks about, well, sometimes a word, it's not like a chessboard, it's like a football game, right? So the history of the football game actually comes into play at times. Like, man, the team is really tired, or there's more dynamics involved. Like, knowing the history will help you how to play going forward. So once again, you would never say, this is why I use kind and nice. There's nuances between the word. They're basically synonyms. A lot of the times, kind and nice are synonyms, but you would never say you could say he's only being nice, or that's a nice dog, but you would never say he's only being kind. It doesn't make sense because there are nuances of difference, or you never say that's a kind dog. Dogs can't be kind, right? They can be nice, but they can't be kind. Anyway, and those nuances will sometimes kind of come out in language. Because kindness involves motive and heart. And dogs don't have like motives. Yeah, they don't have the same kind of desires and what's that? Yeah, they're being nice. It's not a negative thing, but they don't have the heart behind it. So here's like, I'll give one more example. I know this is all technical stuff. But imagine someone 2,000 years from now finds a sports article about a basketball game, and they don't know anything about basketball. And then they don't know the word backboard, right? It's like, what does this word mean? They could try to figure it out from context. I don't know. It's, whatever. But you could get some clues by what? The history, the etymology of the word. It's the board that's in back, right? And that could be a clue. That's not exactly what it means, a board and back, but the history of that word and how it was formed gives you a clue. And that's kind of what we're saying about Greek words as well, is that the meaning of the word, like butterfly, it doesn't mean butter that flies, but sometimes that history can give us some clues. I mean, butterflies do fly, right? But they aren't butter, so I don't know where that came from, So anyway, I'll give you some examples of this, where it gets real practical. So, for example, in Matthew 6:11, give us this day our daily bread. That word daily, it's nowhere in the Bible. Most likely, Jesus coined that word, or either that or Matthew and Luke coined that word to communicate what Jesus was saying in Aramaic or whatever, right? So how do we figure out what this word means? Like, it has two parts upon the daily, and we put it together and we kind of figure out what it meant. The words absence and presence, in Philippians 2:12 and elsewhere, literally they mean being alongside and being away from, right? And so, once again, that we already knew what those words mean, but you kind of see based, presence and absence. Well, what it really comes into is, have you ever heard of in theology, the parousia, the coming of Christ? That's a technical term that people will talk about, the parousia, the coming of Christ. That's a Greek word. And it means like Christ's second coming. But the literal meaning of the word is being alongside of. So it is about his coming, but it's really more about his presence. Like, he's with us. And you can kind of see that emphasis in the word, even in Philippians, like being present or being away from. I'm going to move on. Philippians. I love this example. He says, not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. Man, that's a great word, content. Literally, that word content there means self-sufficient. And really, if you kind of go in and study the history of that word, like that's the literal meaning, you could see that contentment to Paul is like, I have everything I need in Christ. And that word self-sufficiency was used of like a city in ancient times that had, strong walls. So if they're getting sieged by an army, they were safe inside, right? They're self-sufficient. They're not affected by the siege. And it's a great word, like, how easily are we tossed to and fro by circumstances, right? Easily, often, right? But what's the problem? We don't have everything we need inside of us. Really, God inside of us. And so this idea of self-sufficiency, it's a really rich idea in Paul's theology, is like, I have Christ, and so I have everything I need. It's not, so in that sense, it's not self-sufficient, like I have everything I need in myself. In Paul's theology, it's I have everything I need in Christ who's in me. Right, so I can't be affected by circumstances. It's a lot richer than just content, really. And you could see that by studying kind of the history of the word, the etymology we call it, the how the word is formed. I mean, you could also see that in the dictionary, but Another example would be the word in 1 Peter 3:21. Baptism, which now corresponds to this, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as and this word appeal is kind of the word I'm zooming in on. I think it's the word pledge. Okay, so you could kind of get that from the root meaning of the word. I'm going to move on. In 2 Corinthians 10:1, I, Paul, myself entreat you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. I'm humble with face, but bold towards you when I'm away. What word am I? Oh, when Paul says, I myself entreat you, this is this word that is often translated exhort. And literally what it means is, its kind of historical meaning is call alongside. And so this word could be translated admonish or exhort or even encourage, but the root meaning of the word is alongside. And so, when I don't know about you, when I hear the word exhort, sometimes I get this picture of I'm exhorting you, right? But really the meaning is I'm exhorting you. I'm putting my arm around you. I am speaking to you, but it's very much alongside of. Right? So that's why this word can be I entreat you, but it's very much from the position of alongside. There's kind of a nuance there that you can get from its etymology, that this is not just like, I'm yelling at you, right? I'm very much encouraging and exhorting and entreating, coming from this position of alongside of you. Same thing in 1 Thessalonians. So another example, 1 Thessalonians 5:10. We ask you, brothers, to respect those who labor among you and are over you in the Lord and admonish you. I got some examples in 1 Timothy. This is all the same word. He must manage his own household well. That word manage, there. Let the deacons each be husbands of their own wife, managing their children. Let the elders and this is the same word, rule well. Okay, this word, it's sometimes translated manage or rule. It's literally, once again, stand before. And I would just translate it lead. I think the idea of ruling, in English and in Greek, the word ruling has to do with what? Sovereignty, a king, right? This isn't the word for that. Like there's words, like there's the Greek word for king is, or for rule in that sense is basiluo. It's like, I'm the king, I'm the basilu. Anyway, I'm not going to get into Greek, but that's the word for king. And to rule is to like use the authority of king to rule. That's not this word. This is the word like I stand. It's a leadership word, but it's not this word of authority. It's more of a lead. Like I stand before you. And how do you lead then? By example, by encouragement, by exhortation at times, right? But it's not this kind of authoritative word. You could look up just even in the dictionary to exercise a position of leadership. And, it says rule, direct, to be at the head of, but also is like to have an interest in, to show concern for, care, give aid to, right? So you could see this is not just ruling like a king would rule, or at least a bad king, right? All right, couple more concepts. Minimalism and maximalism. So this is the idea, does every word or every piece of grammar have maximum meaning or minimal meaning, right? And what we have to be careful of here is that, you've probably seen this. You could preach a sermon and it's like every word becomes a sermon, right? What are you doing? You're taking too much out of each word. For the most part, like we're kind of, in this class, we are kind of zooming in on some nuances. And so you might be tempted to like, wow, every word has so much meaning. But that's why I'm kind of ending with this. We want to be careful. For the most part, the meaning is found in the whole. It's found in sentences. It's found in paragraphs, right? As words come together, right, you get the flow of thought as a whole. And so we want to be careful of what's like kind of reading into words. It's like, oh, this word means this. And we're doing a little bit of that because I'm kind of like trying to, every once in a while, there are some significant nuances that we could dig in and find that are very valid. But for the most part, that's just the word lead. You don't need to make too much out of it, right? It's not like if he wanted to preach a whole sermon on what leadership is there, he could have done that. He could have gone on a digression. He could have explained it. He just said lead, so he probably just means lead, right? And so, we want to be careful not to try to make a big deal out of every little thing. So there's a little bit of a tension there, isn't there? Like a detective. I mean, just going back to our analogy. If you're a detective, you walked onto a crime scene, and it's like every little fuzz in the carpet, you're like, ooh, this is a bit. No, it's not. Every little drawer, every little thing. No, not everything is significant. You want to be aware because you never know where you could find that significant clue, right? It's like you walk into here, wait, that cabinet drawer is open. It could be significant. The thief who murdered someone could have opened that, got something out, and left it open, and now that's significant. But it may not be, right? And so that's kind of this idea that we're always in this tension. Like, for the most part, read sentences. The meaning is found in the whole. We don't want to get lost in the weeds. I'm doing that a little bit because I'm trying to help us have good detective. Like, good detectives are notice every little clue, don't they? Right? So we want to be aware of those things, but then it's easy to make a mountain out of a molehill and be walk onto a crime scene. It's wait, the temperature in here is such and such a degree, and this is this. And you're like, that's not relevant. It has nothing to do with this crime or what happened in here, okay? So, there's just a little bit of tension. And I'd say in the main, meaning is found in sentences and paragraphs and just what's the flow of thought? What's the argument of the book as a whole? But then also, as you're reading those things, just be wait a minute, why'd he say still here? Why'd he, I remember the sermon a couple weeks ago, Paul still breathing out threats and murder against the disciples. Luke put the word still in there. Why? To remind us of the past. This is not new. Paul's been doing this. It's a little word. You don't have to make a huge deal out of it, but he included it, right, to tell us, hey, this has been going on. Paul's this murderous guy. Remember who he is, and he's still doing that, right? You see with me? So that little word still, it's not a whole sermon, but it is, like Luke said, chose to say that word. He didn't have to, right? But he chose to put it in there to remind us that this has been Paul's way of life. He's been going this way for a while. Does that make sense? Right? So don't make too big of a deal out of every little word, but then at the same time, just kind of have your detective, what's the author telling us? Okay, and I want to end with just a talk about translations and how translation works. So there is never a perfect correspondence between a word in one language and a word in another language. That's just the nature of translation, right? I mean, the best example I know of from Spanish is the word agua. We translate it water. You probably all know that, right? Agua, water, right? But it's not a perfect correspondence. There's things that native Spanish speakers call, we could ask Sylvia, right? Agua could be like juices, right? You have different kinds of aguas. And we don't have different, I guess we could have sparkling water, but we would never call juice water, right? Does that make sense? But in Spanish, they would, right? Certain kinds of things could be aguas that aren't what we would call waters. Does that make sense? So there's a lot of overlap between agua and water, but they're not perfectly the exact same word. Okay, so because of that, sometimes if you're translating from Spanish to English, most of the time you'll translate agua how? Water. But every once in a while, you won't be able to translate it water, because in English, that's juice. That's not water, right? So sometimes the translation of agua really is more like liquid, right? You with me? In other words, the translation of agua is a little bit broader. And so there's never this word in this language is exactly the same in this word in this language, or this grammatical rule is the exact same in this language and this language. They're never identical. They're different languages. And so the nature of translation is you're always trying to bring across the meaning. Does that make sense? What does this mean in this language? And that's why, and sometimes you're going to have to translate agua juice, right? Why? Because that's what it means in English. Okay? Now, the problem with that, and this is where you get into this tension, because ideally, you would love it if every time the word agua occurred, you translate it water, because then what? Then you know. So for example, let's say an author is writing a poem in Spanish about agua and the beauty of agua. Are you with me? Let's just imagine this, right? They're writing this poem, this beautiful writing about agua and all why they love water and all the different. And now you translate that into English, and guess what? Some of the times it's not agua, it's juice or this or that or liquid. And the problem is now you look at this poem, and some of the times you're trying to give this ode to water, you're actually, like, it's not using that word, and so you don't make the connection. Are you with me? And so translators have this tension. Do I always use the same word? But if I always do that, it's not going to make great sense in English because, we don't say orange water. We say orange juice. You with me? And if I translate it as orange water, that's not even the best example because that they have a different word for that. I'm not a native Spanish speaker, obviously. But anyway, you get the point, right? It's like, so more literal translations, we would call them formal equivalence translations. They try to use the same word the same way all the time, right? Now, that's going to make it so that it doesn't always make great sense in English. It will actually make it a bad translation in some ways in terms of what it actually means. Does that make sense? Because words have ranges of meaning, and if you really want to translate the meaning, right, then you're going to have to use different words for this one word. But there's a tension there because I also want to be able, as I'm studying my Bible, to see, oh, this is the same word all throughout it. Oh, and this is the same word Paul uses here that Peter uses here. And it's nice to be able to see it's the same word. Does that make sense? Right? So that's why we have different translations. And different translations were made for different purposes, okay? So, and we have to understand these purposes if we're going to use our translations wisely. Okay, so I want you all to know that, like, a translation like the NIV. Now, there may be things I disagree with, but just in terms of translation philosophy, it's a valid translation philosophy to translate the meaning and be very concerned with translating the meaning, and in that sense, being less woodenly literal. Are you with me? Right? So, different translations try to do this different ways. I mean, but I want you to understand, for the most part, these are different translation philosophies and different purposes in translation. So if you want, the translation that kind of brings across the meaning, sometimes you want a less literal translation. Does that make sense? So we call these formal equivalents and dynamic equivalents. Formal equivalence is like, we try to keep it as close to the exact word order in Greek. We try to, and then others is like, we try to bring across the meaning into English as best we can. And there's just this tension. And the reason I say this is I am someone who really holds to the value of, like, what we would call maybe like literal translations. I love the NASB and now the Legacy Standard. These are very, very kind of literal translations, but they're not necessarily better in all cases. Sometimes they actually bring across the meaning worse than the less literal translations because they're preserving the word order, right, which doesn't come across well into English. So the point of this is it's good to read lots of translations, and there's lots of good translations, and we don't want to bash different translations. They all have value, and especially since most people don't know Greek and Hebrew, what's the solution? Read the Bible in lots of different translations. And what that will allow you to do is to compare and contrast and say, oh, what's the author emphasizing? And they'll bring it out in different ways. Does that make sense? And so once again, as a good detective, read it. I mean, we all know some of the better translations. Like I already mentioned, some of the more literal ones would be the NASB and the NASB, we call it, or now the Legacy Standard. Those are both very literal. And then, like, just shy of that would be like the ESV, the Holman Christian Standard Bible. Those are both pretty literal. They try to, but just a step down from that. And then we get probably to the NIV and even, obviously there's a ton of Bible translations. They all fit kind of on that spectrum somewhere. But there's a lot of good translations, and we don't want to bash them just because they're not as literal. Now, obviously something like the Message, that is, I wouldn't even call that a Bible translation. I would just call it a paraphrase, right? It's almost like a commentary. It's so far from the actual text that it's like, you would just call it a paraphrase or almost like a commentary on the Bible. And so at that point, I would say it's not a good translation. That's not what it is, right? But even that has some value just to think about. Is that what it meant? Like it's not heretical and I might do it differently if I was doing my own paraphrase. But paraphrases aren't evil as long as you understand what they are and what they're for. Does that make sense? Like, because we believe that the actual words of God are inspired, obviously there's value in translating, trying to get that meaning across. But I guess I just want to, there's kind of an error in thinking the more literal a translation is, the better it is. It doesn't work like that. Because, like for example, we talked about idioms, right? Bite the bullet, kick the bucket. If you do an idiom in Greek, you won't know what it means. It won't make any sense to you because we don't have those idioms in English, right? And so is it better to translate, bite the bullet or let's just take kick the bucket? Is it better to translate kick the bucket or is it better to translate it died? Probably for us English speakers, let's just translate it died so we all know what it means. Right? Maybe with a footnote or something, literally kick the bucket and someone could study what that means. Does that make sense? It's not better to translate kick the bucket. Just for someone that doesn't know that idiom, it's meaningless. Right? And so we just have to be kind of careful about, just bashing less literal translations or thinking this one, the goal is to translate the meaning of Scripture. All right, and to get that across. And so there's kind of pros and cons for both. That's going back to that example, the word chesed again. If you're trying to be super literal, you should try to aim for one word in Greek or Hebrew should translate into one word in English, right? Otherwise, you're ending up with, for every Greek word, you have a sentence in English, right? And then what do you end up with? A paraphrase. You see what I'm saying? So there's just this tension, how much do you kind of explain in translation? How literal? How much are you focusing on the meaning? And so, if you have a rich word like that, you just look at the word chesed. Most English translations translate a bunch of different ways, depending on the nuance and the context. And that's okay. That can often just be a good way to bring across the meaning. But then if you're really studying, where is this word used all throughout the Bible, you want a word that a translation that keeps it the same so you could see those connections with the word. Okay? So in that sense, the concept of a literal translation is linguistically naive in the sense what do you mean by literal, right? Do you mean you're communicating the meaning or you're just taking one word and finding, we call it a one-word gloss. If you were to look up a word in the dictionary, a good dictionary, a gloss is agua means water, okay? But a good dictionary, do you know what it'll actually do? It'll give you a definition. It'll give you a sentence, and it will say something like a clear liquid that's not too viscous or whatever the definition of agua is into English, right? It'll give you this is what this means, and it's not one word because they're trying to give you the whole sense of it. But then when you translate that word, you're not going to put that whole sentence in every time. You with me? But that's what it means. So, and then some words like bank, right? We talked about that, has multiple meanings. You can't put all those meanings. You have to figure out which meaning it means in the context and pick a word. And so, once again, translations can be more formal or more dynamic, focusing more on translating the meaning or translating the forms of the original, but neither one is more literal or better in that sense. We could use literal that way. This is a better translation because it uses the same word every time. Well, it has a huge value, and I love that, but that's not better in every case. Does that make sense? So that's part of just like being aware of how translation works, hopefully helps us to just make good use of our Bibles, read lots of translations, compare them, and really be asking, because I guess you could put it this way, both the form of the original and the meaning of the original are both important. Like, in other words, the word order, the structure, how the author said it, using the same, hey, this author used the same word 10 times in this chapter. That's important. Maybe he uses it in different senses all throughout the chapter. Like, what I did have an example in here. Yeah, the Hebrew word tzedakah. It could mean like honesty, loyalty, righteousness, and justice. Wow, that's kind of a broad range of meaning, right? So how should you translate that? Well, in different contexts, once again, you would translate it, each one of those words, right? But if you look it up in a dictionary, you could even see like how those connect, how those different nuances fit together. So most translations are going to translate that word a bunch of different ways depending on the context. But it would also be nice to be able to see, oh, this same word, man, it's used a bunch of different ways, but it's the same word all throughout this chapter. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so there's value in saying, okay, this word, we're going to always translate it one way, even though it has all these meanings. And then there's another value in, we're going to translate this word kind of what it means in the given context. And so we would call that a more dynamic translation and a more formal translation. For studying, often we want a more formal translation. But then often when we're, especially for a new believer or whatever, we want just to be able to like, what does it mean? What's the author trying to communicate? All right. And then, of course, we already talked about idioms. And so basically, as we kind of come to the end of this, linguistics, just the studying and thinking about language, that's what I'm encouraging all of us. I mean, obviously, there's a bunch of books you could read, but the general way that we know the correct meaning of words and the significance of grammatical constructions, like if you want to ask, what does a linguist do? They take a word, they find all the different ways it's used in like ever, or in the whole Bible, and they categorize all the different meanings and say like, what are all the different ways this word can be used? And so sometimes that's what we want to do. We're going to talk about doing word studies where we say like, okay, this word righteousness, okay, it's translated righteousness here, but here it kind of seems to mean something like justice. What does this word mean? How does it really work? Man, study that word. Find every time do a search. Find every time it's used in the Bible and just get a feeling for that word. Because once again, that word isn't going to have just like a single English word that means everything it means. And so that's what linguists do. They're just making observations about how words are used, how grammar is used, and they list like 1,000 or 10,000, whatever, all the different usages. They start categorizing it and describing. It's like how these words work, how this grammar works. And, but for us, I'm more just encouraging us, man, just be good detectives, ask good questions. I promise we won't get this kind of technical in the rest of the class. This is kind of just theoretical, laying the foundation for language and how it works and being good to and we'll come back and I did it first because we'll reference some of this stuff, as we come to different verses and different principles, but we're going to get a lot more just practical in this. But I wanted to kind of lay a foundation that, man, language and the way it works, it's just like it does in English. Just the way that we communicate. And so we're going to be good detectives to look at the word and see how do we study the word for ourselves. All right. So I know that's a lot of data dump on you, but I hope that kind of lays the foundation, gives us a grid for just like, why did the author say this? I mean, that's really what we're getting at in a lot of different ways. So questions or comments? All right. Thanks for coming, and we'll come back next time.